The room went quiet the moment my husband said it. "You're fired, not laid off, not reassigned. Fired. And he didn't say it privately. He said it in the Monday morning executive meeting with the entire leadership team sitting around the glass conference table. I remember noticing small details in that moment. The humming of the air conditioner, the faint clicking of someone's pen, the smell of burnt office coffee drifting in from the hallway. No one moved across the table. Standing confidently beside my husband Mark was the woman I had suspected for months. Ashley. Tall, perfect hair, expensive heels, and smiling. Mark straightened his suit jacket and cleared his throat like he was about to deliver an important speech. "This decision wasn't easy," he said. His voice carried that calm, corporate tone he used whenever he wanted to sound reasonable. "But the company needs fresh leadership and a new creative direction." Fresh leadership. Ashley stepped slightly closer to him, as if she already belonged there. "This is Ashley Carter," Mark continued. "She'll be stepping in as our new Chief Product Officer." My position, the one I had held since the company was founded, 27 employees were watching the scene unfold. Some looked uncomfortable, some stared down at their laptops, and a few looked at me with a kind of sympathy people reserve for someone who's about to be humiliated. Most people in my position might have reacted emotionally. After all, the company Mark had just pushed me out of wasn't just any company, it was ours. Or at least, it had been. We started it together 10 years earlier, back when the office was a spare bedroom in our small apartment, back when we were surviving on cheap takeout and sleeping 4 hours a night while trying to launch our first product. But the part Mark seemed to forget, that morning was something very important. The company may have been our idea, but the technology that made it successful had always been mine. I didn't argue with him. I didn't yell. I simply nodded. "Understood," I said calmly. For a brief moment Mark looked surprised. I think he expected a scene, tears maybe shouting instead. I stood up quietly, walked out of the conference room, and returned to my office. I grabbed a cardboard box from the supply cabinet and placed it on my desk. Inside the box went a few personal things. A framed photo of my father, the first prototype circuit board I had designed when the company was still an idea, a worn notebook filled with early sketches of the compression algorithm that would eventually make our product famous. When I picked up my coffee mug, I paused for a second. The words printed on it read, "Invent first, celebrate later." I smiled slightly. Across the office, people were pretending not to watch me. When I finished packing, I carried the box toward the elevator. Just before the doors closed, Mark's voice echoed across the office. "Elena," I turned. "Security will deactivate your system access by the end of the day." I nodded. "Of course." Then the elevator doors closed. 2 hours later, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea. My name is Elena Hart, and the company my husband had just proudly taken control of existed because of a single invention, an invention protected by a patent, my patent, 10 years earlier. Before Mark and I were even married, I had developed a data compression system that allowed digital files to process 5 times faster than traditional methods. The technology was groundbreaking. It became the backbone of the product our company built. Investors loved it, clients depended on it, the entire platform relied on it, and when I filed the patent, I used my maiden name, Elena Hart, not Elena Walker at the time. Mark didn't think it mattered. "We're married," he said back then. "What's yours is mine." I believed him, but the law didn't. I opened my laptop, logged into the United States Patent Office portal. Then I pulled up the licensing agreement that allowed our company to use the patent technology. The document was only 5 pages long. Had written it myself years earlier, when our first lawyer recommended protecting the intellectual property properly. There was one clause that caught my eye. Licensure retains the right to revoke usage rights at any time with written notice. Licensure, that was me? I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. Strangely, I didn't feel angry. I felt calm, clear, like someone who had just solved a puzzle. Mark believed he had taken everything from me that morning. My job, my role in the company, my place in the office. We built together, but he had overlooked the foundation. That entire company stood on dot, and foundations are important. Without them, buildings collapse. I opened a new document. The revocation letter took less than 10 minutes to write. Once it was finished, I digitally signed it and attached it to 3 emails. One to the company's legal department, one to the board of directors, and 1 to the patent registry. Then I clicked send. The next morning my phone started ringing at exactly 7:12 a.m. Mark watched the screen light up and vibrate across the kitchen counter. I let it ring. Then it rang again and again. After the 4th call, the messages started arriving. Elena, call me. What did you do? The system is down. Elena, this isn't funny. I poured myself a cup of coffee. By the time I finished the first sip, my phone rang again. This time it wasn't Mark. It was Daniel Brooks, the company's chief legal officer. Elena, he said carefully, I assume you're aware that the patent license has been revoked. Yes, I replied calmly. Daniel sighed. Legally you are within your rights, but the platform cannot operate without that license. I know. Another pause. The board is demanding an emergency meeting. I'm sure they are. By mid-morning, the entire company was in chaos. Without the patent license, the software powering the company's devices could not legally run. Servers were being shut down. Distribution had stopped. Client contracts were being suspended. And investors were calling nonstop. The company Mark had proudly taken control of less than 24 hours earlier was elapsing, and he knew exactly why. At around 2 in the afternoon, my doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Mark was standing there. He looked exhausted, like someone who hadn't slept. Elena, he said quickly, we need to talk. I leaned against the doorframe. I thought you fired me. This isn't about that. Of course it is. Mark rubbed his face nervously. The investors are panicking. The board wants answers. We need the patent reinstated. I folded my arms. Why? His expression shifted from frustration to disbelief. Because the company will fail without it. I nodded slowly. That sounds like a leadership problem. Elena, please. For the first time in our entire marriage, Mark sounded desperate. You're destroying everything we built. No, I said quietly. You did that yesterday. He stared at me. You're doing this out of spite. This isn't spite. I replied, it's business. Mark shook his head. You're emotional right now. I smiled slightly. No, Mark, I'm prepared. He stepped closer. What will it take to fix this? Finally, the real question. I met his eyes. You sign over majority ownership of the company. His face went pale. That's insane. Then the patent remains revoked. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Mark said something quietly. Ashley left this morning. I raised an eyebrow. When the board realized the company might collapse, she packed her things and walked out. Of course she did. People like Ashley only stay while the money flows. Mark looked defeated. You planned this. I shook my head. No, you fired me in front of my own team. You replaced me with your mistress. You assumed I would quietly disappear. I stepped back toward the door. But you forgot something important. Mark looked up. What? I built the foundation you were standing on. 3 weeks later, the board removed Mark as CEO. Investors demanded restructuring. The company survived, but Mark didn't. Ashley disappeared completely. And eventually the board asked me to return. Not because of revenge, because they finally understood who had built the company in the first place. The strange thing is, I never felt triumphant, just peaceful sometimes. The most powerful response to betrayal isn't anger, it's silence. Because the calmest person in the room is often the one holding the real power. And the moment someone believes they can replace you is usually the moment they discover how valuable you really were. Asterisk, the board meeting happened 2 days later. I wasn't invited at first, at least, That was the original plan. Mark and the board believed they could pressure the legal department into finding a loophole in the patent agreement. They assumed there had to be some clause buried somewhere that would allow the company to continue using the technology without me. There wasn't. The problem with carefully written legal contracts is that they tend to mean exactly what they say, and the contract I had written 10 years earlier was very clear. The license could be revoked at any time by the patent holder, which meant the entire system that powered our products was now unusable. Servers that once processed millions of data requests per day were now sitting idle. Clients were demanding explanations, investors were furious, and Mark was learning a lesson he had never expected to learn. Power in business doesn't come from titles, it comes from leverage, and he had just handed mine back to me. Late that afternoon, my phone rang again. This time it wasn't Mark, it was Daniel Brooks-Alina. He said, sounding tired, "The board would like you to attend the emergency meeting tomorrow morning." I didn't answer immediately. "Will Mark be there?" I asked. "Yes." "Then I'll come." The company building looked the same when I walked in the next morning. Glass walls, modern furniture, the quiet hum of expensive equipment running in the background. But the atmosphere had changed. Employees who once greeted me warmly now looked nervous. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Others gave small, relieved smiles. Word had spread quickly. The company wasn't collapsing because of a market failure. It was collapsing because of a personal betrayal, and everyone knew it. When I entered the boardroom, every seat at the long table was filled. Mark sat at the far end, looking pale and exhausted. The moment he saw me, his expression tightened. I took a seat calmly and placed a thin folder on the table. The chairman of the board cleared his throat. "Thank you for coming, Alina, of course." He leaned forward. "Believe everyone here understands the seriousness of the situation." I nodded. "The patent license has been revoked," he continued. "Without it, our product line cannot legally operate." "That is correct." The chairman glanced briefly at Mark before speaking again. "We would like to discuss possible solutions." I opened the folder slowly. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a revised licensing agreement. The second was a corporate restructuring proposal. The third was Mark's resignation letter. I slid the documents across the table. The chairman adjusted his glasses and began reading. Around the table, the other board members leaned forward. The silence lasted nearly a full minute. Finally, one of the investors spoke. "This transfers controlling ownership of the company to Alina." "Yes," I said. Mark slammed his hand lightly on the table. "This is blackmail." "No," I replied calmly. "It's negotiation." The chairman looked between us. "Alina," he said carefully, "are you willing to restore the patent license under these conditions?" "Yes." "And if we refuse, then the license remains revoked." One of the investors exhaled slowly. Without the patent, the company's valuation had already dropped by nearly 80%. They knew the math. Keeping Mark in control meant bankruptcy. Removing him meant survival. The room remained silent as everyone processed the reality of the situation. Finally, the chairman turned to Mark. "You should step outside for a moment." Mark stared at him. "You're serious?" "Please." Mark stood up slowly. His chair scraped loudly against the floor as he pushed it back. When the door closed behind him, the conversation changed instantly. Investors began speaking quietly. Legal advisors flipped through documents. Within 15 minutes, the decision was made. When Mark returned, the chairman looked at him with calm finality. "The board has accepted Alina's proposal." Mark froze. "You're removing me? You will be compensated for your shares," the chairman said. "But you are no longer CEO." Mark looked around the room as if hoping someone would object. No one did. The chairman slid the resignation letter toward him. "Please sign." Mark stared at the paper. Then he looked at me. For the first time since this entire situation began, there was no arrogance left in his expression. Only realization. You planned all this, he said quietly. I shook my head. No, you just underestimated me. The transition happened quickly. Within 48 hours, the patent license was restored under the new corporate structure. The servers came back online. Clients were reassured. Investors relaxed. The company stabilized. Mark packed his office the same way I had packed mine. Quietly, without an audience, without a speech. I wasn't there when he left, but several employees later told me the entire floor had watched him walk to the elevator. The same way they had watched me. There's a strange symmetry in moments like that. 3 months later, the company was stronger than it had been in years. We expanded the development team, released a new version of the platform, signed to major international contracts, and most importantly, we rebuilt the culture that had been quietly eroding under Mark's leadership. One evening, I stayed late at the office, reviewing product updates. The city skyline outside the windows glowed softly against the night sky. Daniel Brooks walked into my office and leaned against the door frame. You know, he said, most people would have burned the entire company down out of revenge. I looked up from my laptop. That wouldn't have solved anything. He nodded slowly. You handled it. Professionally, I smiled faintly. Sometimes the most powerful response isn't destruction. It's control. Daniel laughed softly. Remind me never to underestimate you. Good idea. A few weeks later, I received a message from Mark. It wasn't an apology, just a short note. I should have listened to you years ago. I read it once, then closed the message. Some lessons arrive late, but they still arrive. Looking back, now, I realize something important. Mark believed power came from titles, from ownership, from being the loudest voice in the room. But real power is quieter than that. Real power is preparation. It's the work you do when no one is watching, the systems you build, the foundations you create. Because when someone tries to push you aside, those foundations are the only thing keeping everything standing. And when they forget who built them, that's when reality has a way of reminding them. Sometimes loudly, but sometimes very, very quietly. And quiet power is often the strongest kind.